And hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives. And I almost said good morning, but actually I should just say hello because Harley Schlanger is over in Germany, where it is this afternoon. So good afternoon, Harley.
And good morning to you.
Thank you. This
Or
is
as we say here, Guten Morgen.
okay. Good morning. And guten Nachmittag, I should say to you back. Good
Guten Mittag,
afternoon.
yeah.
Thanks so much. You guys are so busy right now. You're organizing a number of conferences, and you've been very active in your writing. I appreciate every day getting a copy of EIR, the latest publications from Larouche organization, and I know you're very, very busy, so it's really gracious, and I do appreciate your making time for us here at Macduff Lives. Thank you, Harley.
Well, it's good to have time to do things. I mean, this is, in a way, John, years from now, assuming we make it through this period of time, it will be quite interesting to look back and see what we did and whether it made a difference. And hopefully it will, because if we don't make a difference, things are going to get a lot worse very quickly.
Well, speaking of differences, yesterday on your daily update, you announced what I would call a watershed in world events. That no longer is the unipolar order going to be able to dictate the terms of our world affairs, and it signifies China and a Russia standing up together, saying no. In other words, Harley, what if they gave a war and nobody came?
You know, John, you and I have been talking about this over the last months, that what people haven't seen is that the unipolar world order is based at this point on bluffing and the idea that the whole world will unify behind an Anglo-American military empire, a financial empire, a scientific empire, and that everyone will be forced to kneel before it, give up their sovereignty, give up their defense of the common good for their people and other people. And that's what is taken for granted by arrogant people like Tony Blinken, the Mike Pompeos of the world, leaders of both parties in the United States. And what we're seeing is that power is not so palpable to the rest of the world right now. The United States had to leave Afghanistan with its tail between its legs. And, you can criticize how Biden did it, but we were going to get out of there sooner or later. We made a mess of the place. There was no government in place that could have protected the people against the Taliban. So what it showed is that the U.S. unipolar power was incapable of remaking a country in our image, especially when the main interest of the unipolar power brokers was to make money for themselves. So we've been talking about the end of this post-Cold War era for the last year or so. Now, what changed in the last week is that Putin and Xi Jinping signed a 16-page agreement with all kinds of economic initiatives, some military strategic initiatives. But that's not the main point. The point is that they were saying, we are no longer going to tolerate being dictated to. The idea is that the unipolar world no longer exists, and we will not tolerate it. Now, it wasn't meant as a hostile statement. They were simply saying, this is the way it is. And this is what people like Blinken and Boris Johnson don't want to hear. Now, look at what the rest of the world is doing. Macron was just in Moscow for a 5-hour meeting yesterday with Putin. And, France is still somewhat of a power. It's an economic power. It is a nuclear power. It's a mess right now. The country's riven with the same kind of polarization we have in the United States. But Macron went to Putin and said, okay, let's discuss your ideas. Maybe some of them are valid. Maybe some of them we can't really help you with. But let's try and work something out. Then he went to meet today with Zelensky in Ukraine. Now, the proof of there are two ways to look at this end of the unipolar world. I quoted from a Financial Times article, which came out on Friday, right after the Russia-China meeting. And it's important because the Financial Times is the City of London, and it's also the strategic uh, center of intelligence in the United Kingdom. And they were the ones who said the unipolar world no longer exists, that there are whole sections of the world's population that do not agree with the policies of the United States and the United Kingdom and NATO. And now Russia and China have formalized that disagreement. Now, at the same time, in a more hostile manner, Frederick Kemp of the Atlantic Council released a statement where he said, this is big, it's a tectonic shift, but what is it really about? Russia and China don't like us. They want their own authoritarian regime. And here's what he said, which shows how clueless these guys are. He said, this is an alliance of authoritarians who censor their media, who jail their dissidents, who silence the opposition. Now, he could be talking about the United States, couldn't he? But he meant Russia and China. Then he said, not since World War II has there been such an agreement of authoritarians. And what was he talking about? The Axis powers, Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese. So he's comparing Putin and Xi, who say they want to negotiate all these things. They want to negotiate a secure world for everyone. He's comparing that to the war machine of Hitler and the Japanese. So you can see the establishment is hysterical about this, and they won't acknowledge it. That's why they won't negotiate with Putin on his new treaties. So all I did was put together what has been obvious for quite a while, including the fact that it's obvious to people at the Financial Times, it's obvious to people at the Atlantic Council. They're really at the center of the unipolar world, but they won't admit it to the population yet. And so what do we have in terms of the rest of the population? How many people do you think, John, of your viewers know much about what happened when Putin and Xi met in Beijing last week? I mean, your viewers tend to be more astute than the average population, but how could they find out about what happened? Where would they go?
It's the first time hearing it, Harley, and I think your point is exactly, you're right on point, that we don't hear these things, or perhaps we hear like Putin and Xi had a meeting this weekend, but there's no content. So it's, well, okay, they had a meeting, so what? You know, hi, bye, you know.
And then, John, I'm sure you saw this, the lamentable Ned Price confronted by an honest Associated Press reporter. Did you see that exchange?
Yes, and last night we had Garland Nixon on last night, and he just completely tore it up. And it was perhaps another watershed where you see a actual real reporter not letting go. You know, most of the time they take a little nip, and then if they don't get anything, they run back away, you know. But this guy, he grabs onto the ankle and he hangs on to the ankle, and it's like, answer my question, God damn it, answer the question, and he never did.
He was absolutely right. Ned Price, for those who haven't seen it yet, and you can see it, it's all over the internet, it's gone viral. Price was for 11 years in the CIA. He left the CIA in 2017 because he said he opposed the way Trump was getting rid of some senior intelligence people. Now, he didn't leave the CIA because the CIA was involved in coups, torture, spying on the Congress, spying on everyone. No, he didn't have that kind of morality. He didn't like Trump, so he left the CIA. And he ends up in the Biden administration, and he was sent out to say that the U.S. intelligence has evidence that the Russians have prepared fake videos of attacks against the Russian population in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, and they're going to use this as a false flag. He said they have crisis actors, they have the whole 9 yards. So this reporter, Matt Lee from the Associated Press, who's a longtime reporter, he asked the relevant question. Well, where's the evidence? And Price said, well, I just gave it to you. And he said, no, you just told us something. You didn't give us any evidence. Where's the evidence? And Price said, well, when we declassify something, that's the evidence. And Matt Lee said, no, that's not evidence. That's your opinion. Where's the evidence? Now, that's what I mean when I say that the reign of the unipolar world is gone. This is
Well,
the emperor with no clothes.
but he says sources and methods. Sources and methods. I can't disclose sources and methods. You just have to trust me. And that's where I think trust me. You put your little fingers down on the desk and you say, trust me. You
And
know,
what did he say on that? He said, so you obviously don't trust US and British and other intelligence. Now,
that's
Matt
it.
Lee never said a word about British intelligence. So Ned Price let everyone know where this actually came from. But then he said, so if you want to just take what you're getting from the Russians, go ahead. So in other words, basically accusing this Associated Press reporter of being a Putin puppet. So, I think this is the kind of thing that goes beyond just seeing someone lie. It shows that they have an arrogant disregard for the truth and a hatred of people who call attention to the fact that they're obviously making up a story. And that's happening over and over and over with the white helmets and the sarin gas story, with the Navalny case, with the Skripal case, with the Uyghur case. These are one narrative after another that are falling apart. Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokesman for the Russian foreign ministry, said today, well, gee, it's heading toward mid-February. I don't think we've invaded yet, have we? Now, last Friday, Bloomberg News in the afternoon put out a headline, Russia invades Ukraine, which was the headline for 30 minutes. Given what Bloomberg News is, one of the more important business outlets that's running on almost everyone's computer, can you imagine the panic that sent through the financial world? Well, they said it was inadvertent, or maybe a test case. But that's where we are. This situation is falling apart. They can't pull it back together. The Russians and Chinese have made it clear that the Green New Deal is not going to work the way Prince Charles and the John Kerry and the Greenies want. They've also made it clear that they're not going to give up their economic sovereignty. And a big part of the Russia-China deal is economics. I met with someone today who's involved in Germany on the gas deal with Russia. And he said, well, how is pricing the gas above the ability of the German consumer to afford to heat their home and put gas in their car? How is that hurting Russia? That's hurting people in Germany. Don't they get it? Now, I don't know. You think they get it? You think they're trying to do something bad to Germany? No, I think they really think that shutting down a pipeline with gas going into Germany is somehow going to weaken Russia. And this is part of the reason the German government, the Scholz government, is not groveling completely to Biden. He's groveling some, but not completely. And you probably saw this, John. The Germans were pressured. Why don't you sell weapons to Ukraine? Do something to help them in the war. So they sent them a bunch of war surplus helmets.
I wanted to know, were they the pickle helmets? With the spike?
World War I surplus, maybe.
I wanted to see those helmets desperately. I thought, oh, these are great. They're going to be the Kaiser's helmets.
Well, I was joking when they said they were going to send them helmets. Maybe they were thinking Helmut Schmidt and Helmut Kohl.
Oh, that's an emphasis for me of, yeah, I know those names. And for a minute, if I took a minute, I could patch them into my historical knowledge bank. But understanding things from Europe or from Germany, for us sitting over here, especially with the lockdowns, it's very difficult. We hear a lot of names, and I know a lot of but it's such a complex thing to try to understand what's going on in Europe or in Germany or in Berlin or in any particular context. So That's why I find one reason I find these conversations so valuable, and I'm grateful. Um, Harley, what do you think about the Canadian truckers? It, is it getting a lot of coverage in Germany? Is it are there are I understand that the German in Europe there's these trucker things that are not related uh, to this, maybe having to do with fuel prices or something else. But
Well, the
yeah.
French, the so-called yellow vests, in Europe, if a car breaks down, you're supposed to get out of the car and put on a yellow vest. It means emergency. And
Mhm.
so the so-called yellow vest movement was French truckers protesting the government's green tax that was raising the price of gasoline. And then it sort of spread into other areas. The farmers picked it up because they can't afford fertilizer right now. Also, the European Union has a new agriculture program. I think it's called From Farm to the Fork, which is basically taking farmland out of production, supposedly for environmental benefit. It's similar to the United States, where you have something called 30 for 30, which is reducing by 30% American farmland by 2030. So we just put out a short video on the Schiller Institute website. Why won't they let farmers produce? We just today, the World Food Program announced a red alert emergency in the Horn of Africa, 13 million people facing starvation, on top of the people facing starvation in Yemen and Syria due to US sanctions, in Afghanistan due to the US freezing of funds. There are people hungry all over the world, and they're shutting down farm production. They're driving nitrogen prices and natural gas prices through the roof, which makes fertilizer unaffordable. The main thing, John, is when you raise this question about not knowing what's going on in Europe, most people in Europe don't know what's going on in Europe. You've got this crazy system with the European Union where rules and laws are made every single day in Brussels that are applicable to every single country. And a lot of these countries don't find out about them until the police show up at the door and they say you're breaking an EU regulation by using the wrong kind of fertilizer. So there is a deliberate sowing of confusion, and that's where the lack of trust is. We see it with Corona. You mentioned the truckers. The question of mask or not mask, this has become now the big social issue of the day. We're facing nuclear war. And, I think that it's fine to see people in a rebellious state of mind because they should be. But I think we have to make sure we're facing the right enemy and the right issues. And I think some of this gets diverted into what may not seem like a side issue if you're a trucker, that if you don't get vaccinated, you can't drive a truck. That's your living. But suppose they drop all the mask mandates. We're still going to have an absolute corrupt cabal making policy. And the policies they're making that will affect your life much more fundamentally are the ones that are going to end up costing you more because of the Green New Deal, robbing your bank because of bailouts and bail-ins, and getting the United States into more wars, including a possible nuclear war. So, I am watching the trucker strike. I think Trudeau has gone out on a very dangerous limb. Uh, he's been up there before. I don't know Canadian politics well enough to know, but what I do see is this lack of trust and anger. And we have to take people above the anger to realize that the effect of the policies, the worst thing, is not just a question of your freedom to wear a mask or not wear a mask. Your fundamental human right to life is what's being destroyed by this cabal. And that's where what we try to do with the Schiller Institute is get people to understand what are the issues, who's involved in this, get a sense of a historical perspective so that when you decide to march, you're not like Charlie Chaplin in the movie where the flag falls off the truck and he walks down the street waving a red flag and a protest comes up behind him and you don't know who you're marching for or against, but you're out there anyway. People need to know what the issues are and the solutions. And that's what Lyndon LaRouche was trying to do his whole life. We're coming up on the third anniversary of his passing on February 12th, and we're going to have a commemoration on the 12th at 2 o'clock Eastern time on the SchillerInstitute.com, where we're just going to go through some of the examples of Lyndon LaRouche's prescience, his forecasting, his ability to sniff out operations. And I encourage people to join us. That's this Saturday, 12th of February at 2 p.m. Eastern time on the SchillerInstitute.com.
All right. Well, I'm going to give you just a little bit of pushback on the Canadian truckers, even though it's not, it's not your field and all, because it's Canadian politics. But I do have to say that at the heart of what they're doing is the right to human life. And at the heart of what they're doing is a sincere concern about what is really in those jabs that they're being forced to give to their families and little kids, and the idea that it's just about something superficial is a mistake. This is a very, very deeply felt concern for the future of humanity that in their case has come to the fore because of government action, which really, I mean, this really is where if everybody concedes to let the government tell you what your health care has to be from here to the rest of time, then this is a huge watershed for humanity. And those of us that object to it are objecting on the grounds of this is a risk we're being told to take by the government under circumstances where we feel like we're being pushed and rolled and not given enough information, and in violation of the Nuremberg laws and all basic ideas about the Hippocratic Oath, medicine in general. So I think our objections are maybe not being taken into account if it's just a matter of something superficial. Wearing a mask, there are a lot of serious objections to wearing a mask. It's not a superficial thing either, but individual rights versus government. That's the name of the game. Where do you draw the line where I can say no? Do I live in a country where I no longer can refuse somebody imposing an injection into me that may change my life and may change my DNA and my children's DNA forever? I don't want to live in that country either, Harley.
Well, that's where there has to be transparency and debate, honest, open debate. And I think that the government has done an absolutely horrendous job making the case for what they're trying to do. And there have been contradictions, and some of this is just the nature of when you deal with something that you don't really know when it first hits. But they got off on the wrong foot, and people became suspicious for good reason because the government has lied to us. Now, on the other side, when you raise the question of individual rights, you do come to something called the common good. How can we determine what is the common good? For example, during World War II, the government had the right to draft you and send you to war. There are things that people have agreed to in the past. Would that happen again today? If there was a just war and the government made the case for it, would people then be able to say, well, I don't want to be told what I have to do? So I think when you live in a society, there has to be a legitimate, transparent debate. My biggest complaint about this is that it hasn't been that way from either side. I don't buy some of what's been said by the government about how to deal with COVID, but I also don't buy a lot of what people are citing as scripture from some of these websites that you're injecting razor blades into your body when you get a shot or.
Yeah.
So I think this is where truth has been lost. And we live in a world of narratives, not truth. And the question of how to get back to truth, that's the real fight.
Amen. Let's get back to truth. And people that send out somewhat believable, but really distracting and wrong information on YouTube's, etc., I find they're probably working for the CIA, just sending out some
Yeah,
crap that other people will latch on to in order that they can be discredited after they vouch for it. That type of thing.
well, and when you look at this, you look at what happened around the Iraq War, where Colin Powell held up this vial and he said, we
Yeah,
have evidence this is chemical weapons that are being used. We have pictures of trucks in the desert that are mobile weapon labs. They look to me from that height, from the U-2 or whatever planes, that they could have been taco trucks. And yet, because the US government has the power to dictate the narrative, they won a vote at the United Nations to go ahead and destroy a nation based on what they knew was fraudulent reporting. And they knew it was coming from the United Kingdom, from MI6. They knew that MI6 has a history of lying for the sake of carrying out wars and launching false flag operations. We know that now. So when Biden or Blinken or Boris Johnson come on television and say, we know Putin's going to invade, we know nothing of the sort. And if you know something about Russian history, it would be clear that that is much less likely than the fact that the US or the British will use a false flag to try and start a war, which they've done repeatedly. So, when you look at these things and then you find something controversial, whether it's with healthcare, whether it's gender identity, whatever it is, people are angry and suspicious right now. And I think we really have to take a step back and look at what's the intention of what's being pushed. Not just one of the ways you sometimes know what's right and wrong is you look at the intention of the people involved. And I know the intention of a lot of doctors who advocate vaccines. They're trying to do good things for their patients. Now, whether they're being poorly advised by big pharma, I can believe that. But I also think that people who are getting angry at the medical profession, there are many, many doctors who have risked their lives to save patients, who are doing it because they do believe in the Hippocratic Oath. So, I guess we disagree a little bit on this question, but I think where we find common ground is that we've got to fight to end this smoke and mirrors use of narratives when it comes to life and death questions.
This Thursday night after tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, I'm going to be doing a review of a book that was published back in the early '80s called "The Rockefeller Medicine Men." By Brown is the last name, and the topic of the book is how corporate wealth came to combine with the science of medicine, or with the practice of medicine. I don't want to call it science because it's more than that. In the late 1800s, and then how we've become saddled with this thing that I think calling it Rockefeller medicine makes as much sense as anything. That the combination of incredibly powerful financial interests with the development of better medicine. It looks like a good idea, but how far have we gone into the profit side to the detriment of the health side? And this is where I think, I want to explore more of that. And I'm with you on that, because there is truth, but there's also, there's Bernays, there's all of the propaganda that we've been subjected to. We have to peel back all of those layers to get to it. And I'm rolling up my sleeves because we got to find out, and we have to work together. So I don't mind disagreeing in the sense that we're going to try to pare away the chaff, from the wheat, and get to the kernel and see, what the real truth is.
And when you're talking about the Rockefellers, remember they were part of the Between the Wars Trust, the Rockefeller Oil Trust,
Yep.
Standard Oil Trust, the rubber trust, the chemical companies that were working hand in hand with the German business that was part of the war machine that was being built up by Hitler. And with the aid and full support of Wall Street and the City of London. So, there is a history. And don't forget, this is also where the eugenics movement came from.
Oh, yeah.
And this was, the famous, the name is escaping me for the moment. It'll come back to me. But Hitler's eugenicist, Ernst Rudin,
Yeah.
who was the leading Malthusian and organizer for euthanasia in Germany, came to the United States, I think in 1932, just before Hitler was in power, or it may have been 33 after Hitler was in power, for a dinner sponsored by the Rockefellers, the Bush family, the Harriman family. And it was to promote the idea of eugenics, the weeding out of the useless eaters. And Rudin remarked at this event how he wishes Germany had the wisdom of the American eugenics movement. And of course, they then adopted the policy. And so we once wrote a pamphlet, before there was Hitler, there was Harvard.
Absolutely. I'd love to see that pamphlet, because my dad went to Harvard, and I've become more and more disillusioned with Harvard every day of my life since I started studying this stuff. And it's not an educational institution. It's a huge academic psyop that creates Frankenstein monsters and calls them scientists. I'm appalled at what's happened to our so-called Ivy League generally. But let me get back though. I love the idea of pursuing what happened, as you pointed out. What happened to these eugenicists? They didn't disappear after World War II. They turned into the Green Revolution. One
of their leaders was Julian Huxley, the brother of Aldous Huxley, who helped set up UNESCO. He got a position at the United Nations from which he could look at the implementation of programs that would reduce populations. And what Julian Huxley basically said, I don't have the exact quote, but he said, look, after Hitler, it's kind of difficult to argue something about a master race, but we do have to realize that the world is limited and we cannot have unlimited population growth. So he was essentially trying to figure out, how do we take a murderous policy and sell it after we've just had this mass murder committed? And that's where the Green Revolution came from.
And now let's add our friend, Prince Philip, the dearly departed, rest in peace, Prince Philip, who said, I want to come back as a virus, a deadly virus, so that we can wipe out all of these useless parts of humanity. And now go from UNESCO to World Health Organization, Bill Gates, and the whole big pharma situation. And I think there is a serious line that you can draw directly from Cold Spring Harbor, to the big pharma vaccination virus game, where they create a virus, they create a vaccine. For biological warfare purposes, they've got to have a vaccine in order to create the virus, so that they can vaccinate your soldiers and use the disease to kill the other guy. There's a lot better ways to kill people now than nuclear weapons. And they figured that out a long time ago, that they can subtly kill people with biological or chemical weapons. And that's where I think we need to pay our attention. The idea of a doomsday clock doesn't resonate. It's like, yeah, you've been talking about nuclear war for my whole life, but and I was really worried about it when I was a teenager and when I was in my 20s and all, and even then I still considered it to be the biggest problem in humanity. but I don't anymore. I think the biggest problem we have in humanity here is a psychological problem. That for some reason this idea of eugenics in by other names is still the main program, and that they do want to reduce population, and they will use any means necessary to do it. And that, if they can't get a war, then they're going to do it some other way. And again, I think that adds some credibility to those of us that don't want to participate in what we see as at best an experiment, and at worst something to control population in the future. That's
John, by that logic, though, the problem you have is that if these diseases are man-made and released from laboratories, they may not have the ability to control it, just as if you do launch a war that triggers nuclear exchange, there's no way to bring it back. If you're not going to worry about nuclear war, I don't think you would have, the logic would say that if they wouldn't launch a nuclear war because they know it might exterminate the human race, they wouldn't use these diseases for the same reason. I think the problem we have to look at with nuclear weapons and with what's going on in Ukraine right now is not necessarily that we're going to have a war in Ukraine that will be a nuclear war, but that the same thing, the same pattern that led to the 2 world wars in the last century, which no one thought were going to happen before they happened, did occur. And with the split-second timing now, with the hypersonic weapons and the new generation's nuclear bombers and the more precise targeting, it is possible that by accident you could trigger what we saw from the Dr. Strangelove as science fiction. So I think the most important thing is to get these lunatics out of office and their fingers off the buttons of these kinds of weapons. And we can identify very clearly who are I would call them nutcases in the military, in the Defense Department, in the intelligence community, who are genocidal lunatics. And we've got to have a movement which insists that no one goes into office who is going to do something that goes against the general welfare. Now, just an example of that. There was a vote on an amendment in the Congress last week brought up by one of the Democrats from the Progressive Caucus. And it was on an amendment to release the funds, the $9 billion that the U.S. is holding that are Afghanistan's money. And with reports coming in now, children are dying. They're already starving to death. They're freezing to death. They're dying from lack of just simple medical care in Afghanistan. And the U.S. government is withholding funds that belong to the Afghan people. Now, the bill was brought, or the amendment was brought before the Congress. I think every single Republican voted against it. In other words, they voted to starve children in Afghanistan because they don't like the Taliban. And quite a few Democrats, I think 40-something Democrats, also voted against it. So the measure failed. That means the United States Congress is now on record in supporting the killing of innocent children and women who everyone in the U.S. says they're so worried about in Afghanistan. They're on record of allowing these people to die by withholding, by literally stealing the money that legitimately belongs to the government of Afghanistan. You don't like the Taliban government? That doesn't matter. It's their funds. If they do something wrong with it, then you can take some action. But in the meantime, you're killing children with this policy.
Did they have an excuse? Well, why? What's their talking point in opposition to releasing the money?
They don't want to give credibility to the Taliban government.
But we already did. We recognized them.
No, we haven't. We haven't recognized them.
Oh, we didn't recognize them.
No one's recognized them, but that's hardly the point. They are the government. If they do bad things, then you figure out how to punish the government. You don't kill the children. That's the problem with these sanctions regimes. Look what we're doing in Yemen, where we're cutting off food and medicine for a whole section of the population there, and giving the Saudis sophisticated targeting mechanisms to blow up and kill the people who are in a rebellion against the Saudi oligarchy. This is the United States as it is today from the standpoint of its government. Is there a conception of the common good? Are we safer if children die in Afghanistan of hunger? No, you're actually creating a potential for radicalization so that you'll have more terrorists come out of this. You're creating refugee crises in that part of Asia. Now, the other problem with the amendment was it said we should give them the money so Afghanistan doesn't turn to China. So it was stupidly phrased, but that's not why the Republicans voted against it. Somehow they think that we should hold on to the money because we don't like the Taliban. So, it shows the kind of depravity which is involved in the deliberations of our highest officers of the land.
I think it's cowardice. I think it's just plain cowardice. From what you said, and I'm just, sitting in the grandstands thinking of what you said. But the reason that they didn't vote to give money to the Taliban is because we've spent 30 years telling everybody the Taliban is bad, bad Taliban. And then, you run for re-election and, hey, he gave money to the Taliban, I don't
Well,
want
you talk about 30 years. If you go back 40 years, we did give money to the Taliban. The United States and the CIA gave billions of dollars of weapons to the Afghan jihadis to fight the Soviets.
Yeah.
Just as we gave money to the Syrian so-called moderate rebels who turned out to be ISIS and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra. So our record is not a pure record of good. It's that we will fund for whatever reason whoever we want to carry out the interests of a global geopolitical doctrine, which is that you cannot allow an alliance of countries in Eurasia and Europe. That's what British geopolitics is. The idea of Eurasian integration with Europe ends the Anglo-American order. It was originally ends the British world order, but after World War II, it became the Anglo-American world order. And that's why we're in these wars. That's why we overthrew Saddam Hussein. That's why we killed Gaddafi. These were governments which would not submit to the anti-sovereign precepts of the world order of Davos and the World Economic Forum and the City of London and so on, Walt Wriston and Robert Rubin and others. They want a global financial dictatorship. Well, the Russians don't. The Chinese don't. The Indians don't. The Nigerians don't. A growing section of the world's population is turning against this empire. And if the American people studied it a little bit more, we would realize that we should be supporting what the Russians are doing, because the Russians are trying to bring down the criminals that are oppressing us in the United States.
Can they do that without bringing down the United States?
Well, that's why the American people have to do it. I mean, the American people don't want to bring down the United States. They want a good government.
Well,
but we haven't had a good government for a long time. We
very,
need to bring down the bad, corrupt government, and that means you have to take on the money interests that fund it and run it. And that's what the real deep state is. The real deep state is not these little FBI guys running around with wiretaps. It's the financial interests. It's the Raytheons, the Bechtels, the large corporations, the Silicon Valley money machine that run these people for Congress because they know they'll do what they want them to do. That's what the target has to be.
You want the American people to do the heavy lifting, and it's our job, and we should be doing the heavy lifting. But look at all the layers of deceit we've been forced to endure, and how hard it is. I mean, I am a pretty well educated person. I'm not bragging. I'm saying that because it hasn't it doesn't mean that I understand what's going on at all. It means that I may have the tools to look under some of the piles of propaganda and find the truth, and that's what I'm trying to do. But we can't be you can't demand us to do something impossible. For instance, Julian Assange. Why aren't the American people united in saying free Julian Assange? Whatever he did, it can't be worth what they're doing to him right now. But you cannot raise the issue in American press. You won't get anywhere with it. Why not?
Well, that's because the press serves the same interest.
Yeah.
The Assange is being punished because he rejected the narrative. He exposed the corruption. He didn't steal, he didn't hack into anything and get the documents. They were given to him. He published them. And what he published were documents which showed that we were being lied to by the government, lied to by the military, by the intelligence community, that the American military was committing war crimes in Afghanistan and then later in Iraq. And it's not that he was saying punish the individual soldiers. He was saying that the whole thing was a war crime. And he should have been a hero for that. Instead, they're punishing the messenger and trying to kill him. Now, the problem is if you talk to most people in the United States and ask them, what did Julian Assange do? I don't think people would know. I think it has been kept out of the media. There's a lot of confusion. People think that he broke into the DNC computers. I think that's another one of these lies that has to be debunked eventually. But that's the problem. But John, no one's going to get the truth from the media. And this is where what we have to do is encourage people to be critical thinkers. The founding fathers were able to do what they did, not because there was no media to counter them. They were being countered by British soldiers being sent to live in their houses. This is one of the issues in Boston, that the British demanded the right to have soldiers stay in the homes of the American colonists. So, you didn't need a wiretap. You had a British redcoat living in your bedroom. But how did they deal with it? With ideas. Benjamin Franklin set up a philosophical and scientific society. He set up a postal service so documents could be distributed to the people who were working with him. And they sat and read these articles, whether it was about Plato on government, studied the works. Those who could read German studied Leibniz, including Franklin. Jonathan Logan, who was one of Franklin's mentors, had a whole collection of Leibniz's works. How many Americans know that at the time of the American Revolution, Leibniz and a guy named Vattel were the two leading experts on the relations between nations and how nations have to organize themselves? These are the things that were being passed around and read by the founding fathers. So they didn't have quick, easy answers from the internet. They actually had to engage with the greatest scientific and philosophical minds in history, whether it was Plato or Leibniz or others. So what we're saying is that's the quality of thinking that's necessary, instead of just reacting to something that could easily be a false flag or a trap. And this is why one of the things Ramsey Clark said about Larouche is that what he found so incongruous about the attacks on Larouche is he said, these are book people. They study, they write, they try to influence using ideas. And if you shut that down, then we're no longer the United States. And that's what they did with the persecution of Larouche.
Yes, and an incredible loss it is that he's passed away. But in the way that he stood up to them and stood up to them for his whole life, he has immortality now, and we know that if you need an icon of how to stand up against the system, well, you can look at what Lyndon LaRouche has done, and not just him, but all of the followers and helpers, including yourself, to try as hard as we can in this little bit of time we're given in this life to do, what it says. Let's find out the truth, because it's only the truth that's going to set us free.
There's I think I've told you this before, a Yiddish proverb I like quite a bit. The truth never dies, but it lives a horrible life.
Mm.
But then you have the other side of it, which Helga wrote a paper one time, Helga Larouche, called The Sweetness of Truth. And what she said is that there's nothing more sweet than actually discovering truth for yourself, so that you know that you have a capacity to use your mind to cut through all the haze and all the confetti and get to the kernel of how things work. And it's a life seeking that, and not seeking it for self, but to share that with everyone. That to me is what is the meaning of life, of leading a good life. And if people do that, then the common good becomes the driving purpose for everything you do. That's, by the way, what the pursuit of happiness means.
I think I've been thinking a lot about the importance of the creativity aspect of humanity as well. And as we read the philosophers of the fact that it is a unique human quality, as far as we know, to be so creative. And here's what is happening, is that if we can get what stops me from being creative is not knowing the truth. But if I know the truth, then I need to communicate that truth. But it's something that people don't know. So I have to find some way to convey it from my heart, my belief, my soul, into them in a way that they will absorb it and say, oh, that makes sense. I agree with that. And then they can carry it on to another person. And I think that's where the gift of creativity comes to us, is to be able to use some amazing facility that we have to actually put into a nutshell some important truth, like an artist of any sort, Beethoven or a great painter.
And John, you know where that comes from. If you go to St. Paul, the idea of agape, that you're doing it out of empathy and love of the other, as opposed to self-love and self-stroking. And if there's something we lack in this society, it's this idea of empathy. How come we will turn our eyes away when people are suffering, who are suffering because of policies of our government? And I think that's where we've got to find a way to prick the conscience, or catch the conscience of the king, as I believe it was Hamlet said. This is what we've got to do, is get people to become aware of the fact that they're complicit in their own self-destruction and the destruction of the future of their children and grandchildren if they don't seek the truth and act on it.
And in all the things that we've talked about this morning, that is completely true. And we've got to, from the COVID questions to the question of war, and the question of what are we going to do about these incredibly insane generals that we're burdened with, and what are we going to do about the corruption of the U.S. Congress, which is really the center of hope for mankind, and it still is. I don't know what to do, but I am going to keep trying, and I know you guys have been trying this for many, many years. I'm relatively new to it, but thanks for making me a part of your day, Harley, and thank you for being part of mine. It's a great pleasure, and I've learned a lot this morning, and I think everybody else has too. But the main thing is, we are absolutely dedicated to the truth, and we'll keep on working together, I'm sure. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure we will. And by the way, remember, this Thursday, 8 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll have a dialogue on the solution to the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan with very interesting people. A 25-year CIA operative named Graham Fuller, Jim Jatras, some people know, a diplomat. Jim is going to speak. Helga is going to speak. Those are our speakers. And then there are people from the Carnegie Institute in Moscow, a Russian university, and then the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, Dr. Andrei Kortunov. So there'll be a 2-hour dialogue that you're welcome to join by logging on to schillerinstitute.com this Thursday morning.
That's a very fascinating cast that you have there, and I know Graham Fuller has been was a big feature in a lot of George Webb's reporting about 2 or 3 years ago, and folks will remember that as we try to uncover more and more layers of what's been going on behind the scenes. All right, sounds good. I'll try to tune in 8 a.m. Eastern time on Thursday.
Well, you say you get up early, so that's the middle of the morning for you.
All right, and you can stay up late to my 8 p.m. show and learn about Rockefeller Medicine if you want.
Okay.
But that'll
All right,
be a little too much to ask. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.